Good evening and welcome back. Wherever you are right now, whether you are lying in the dark with a phone balanced on your chest, or sitting in a chair by a window watching the last of the evening settle over rooftops, or somewhere out in the world I couldn't begin to map, I'm glad you made it here. Take a breath. If you feel like it, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I read them when I can, which is not always when I mean to, but I read them. Tonight we have a long way to go. We're not staying anywhere comfortable. We're going further north than north, further back than history, to a place that existed before the concept of place had been arranged into something a mind could hold. Tonight, we tell the story of the Norse cosmos, not the simplified version, the full weight of it, from the absolute silence before anything existed, through the murder-made world, through the wars and the gods and the heroes and the bound monsters and the wandering and the loss, all the way to the last fire and what, impossibly, came after. This is the story of a universe that believed, at its deepest level, that everything was going to end, and that this knowledge was not a reason to despair, but a reason to stand up straight, hold your shield, and keep going. If you have ever wanted a mythology that looks you in the eye and tells you the truth, this is the one. Before we begin, a word about the sources. What we know of Norse mythology comes to us through a narrow and slightly precarious corridor. The Germanic and Norse peoples who lived these stories did not write them down. The runes existed, but for inscription, not narrative literature. And so the stories passed through oral tradition for centuries, passed through the Viking Age and into the Christianization of Scandinavia, and what survived was preserved mostly by Icelanders. Specifically, a great deal of what we have comes from one man, Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic chieftain, historian, and writer who in the early 13th century compiled the Prose Edda, a handbook of Norse mythology and poetics, written, apparently, to help young poets understand the old metaphorical references they might encounter in the older skaldic poetry. He was a Christian, and he seems to have believed that the Norse gods were originally human kings who had been deified by their grateful subjects over time. He was also meticulous, creative, and clearly charmed by the material he was recording. Without him, we would have much less, but because of him, everything we have comes to us through one man's editorial mind, filtered through a faith that regarded the old gods as something less than divine. We also have the Poetic Edda, a collection of older poems, the Völuspá, the Havamal, the Lokasenna, others that preserve mythological content in a different register, more fragmented, more archaic, closer to the original shapes. When Snorri and the Poetic Edda agree, we feel relatively confident. When they diverge, we are in the country of interpretation, which is interesting territory to travel through. With that said, let us go back, all the way back, to where there is nothing yet to see. The very first thing to understand, and I mean the first, before Odin, before Thor, before any name you may have heard before tonight, is that the Norse cosmos began not with darkness, not with chaos in the Greek sense, but with a very specific configuration of two things that could not reach each other. Two poles, two conditions, waiting. In the north, north of the north, in the space before north had a direction, was Niflheim, the world of primordial ice and fog, a realm so ancient it existed before the concept of age had been invented. At its center was a spring called Hvergelmir, the roaring cauldron, and from this spring poured 11 rivers, the Elivagar, whose names sounded like weather and disaster: Svöl, Gunthra, Fjörm, Fimbulthul, Slíðr, Hríð, Silgur, Ilgur, Víð, Leiptr, Gjöl. They poured out from Hvergelmir and flowed outward and began, in the vast cold gulf between the two poles, to slow and thicken and eventually to harden. The rivers became ice, the ice accumulated. The poison in the water turned to rime, and the rime built up on itself, the way frost builds on a window pane in the deep of winter, layer by patient layer, in the silence, accumulating into something huge and still and ancient beyond reckoning. In the south was Muspelheim, fire, absolute fire, fire that predated anything it could burn, fire that was its own justification and its own world. At its boundary stood an entity called Surtur, with a sword made of the same fire that surrounded him. He is described as dark, or as bright in the particular brightness of the destructive. The sources vary, but his sword blazes, and he has stood at the southern edge of the world since before the world was a world, and he will stand there until the end, at which point he will move. This matters. Surtur is patient in the way that something enormous and flaming can be patient, which is to say, absolutely and terrifyingly. Between these two, between Niflheim and Muspelheim, was the void. The Norse called it Ginnungagap, the gap that gapes, the yawning void. It was not empty in the way of nothingness. It was empty in the way of potential, of held breath, of the moment before. And it was into this space that the two primordial forces eventually extended their reach. Warm air drifting north from Muspelheim, cold fog rolling south from Niflheim, meeting in the middle, and in the meeting, the rime began to thaw, to drip, to pool, and from those first drips of melting ancient ice, something began to coalesce. His name was Ymir, the first being. He was not born. He precipitated, the way ice precipitates from saturated air, the way frost is not made but simply appears. He condensed out of the thaw, and he was enormous, and he was alone, and in his sleep, his body continued to generate. From the sweat beneath his left arm, a male and female emerged. From his legs, one leg breeding with the other, a six-headed being was born. And so the race of frost giants began to multiply in the dark. Before there was a world to live in, before there were words for dark. At the same time, another being condensed from the melting rime, a cow, enormous and primordial, named Audhumbla, hornless cow, or nourishment. She sustained Ymir with her milk, 4 rivers of it flowing from her body into the open mouth of the first giant. And she herself needed sustenance. She found it in the ice. She licked the salt from the frozen surface, and as she licked, the sources give this a duration, 3 days, Methodical and almost domestic, she freed something from inside. The first day, hair appeared. The second day, a head. The third day, the entire figure emerged from the ice, a being named Buri, grandfather of the gods, the first ancestor of the Aesir. Buri had a son named Bor. The mechanism of this reproduction is not specified in any text I am aware of, which is the kind of omission that makes scholars nervous and that I have learned to simply accept as a feature of mythological literature rather than a deficiency. Bor found a wife among the Jötnar, a giantess named Bestla, daughter of a frost giant named Berlthorn, and from their union, 3 sons, Odin, Vili, Ve, 3 sons of a god and a giantess, children of both the divine and the primordial, and they looked at Ymir, the first being, the progenitor of everything, the creature from whose sweat their own great-grandmother's people had come, and they killed him. I want to sit in this moment, because it tends to slide past in retellings, and it should not. Ymir had done nothing wrong. There was no conflict, no tyranny, no war. Odin and his brothers simply decided that a world needed making, that the material for a world was available, and they proceeded. The killing was cosmogonic, not punitive. The world was not liberated from a tyrant. It was constructed from a victim. The blood of Ymir became the seas and lakes, and it rose so quickly and so completely that it drowned nearly all the frost giants. Only 2 escaped, a giant named Bergelmir and his wife, who climbed onto something, a millstone, a boat. The sources disagree on the vessel, but agree on the survival, and from them, the race of Jötnar eventually rebuilt itself. They remembered. The flood of their ancestors' blood is the oldest wound in the Norse cosmos, and the hatred between gods and giants that runs through the entire mythology, that permanent, barely contained tension, the giants always pressing against the borders, the gods always pushing back. It is not abstract, it is ancestral. It comes from a specific morning when the blood rose. Ymir's flesh became the earth. His unbroken bones became the mountains. His teeth and smaller bone fragments became rocks and gravel, the scree that slides down cliff faces, the stones that turn under boots. His hair became trees. His skull became the sky, the dome of heaven, lifted and set at 4 corners by 4 dwarves, Norðri, Suðri, Austri, Vestri, north and south and east and west, who stood at their cardinal stations in the new dark and held up the dead giant's skull and called it the ceiling of the world. Sparks from Muspelheim were gathered and fixed in the skull sky as stars. 2 particularly bright fragments were set on defined paths, one to traverse the sky in daylight, which became the sun, and one to move through the night, which became the moon. They were not always prompt about this initially, these new wandering lights, and so the gods fashioned 2 beings to drive them. Sol, the Sun Maiden, drove her chariot across the sky, pursued by the wolf Skul. This is why the sun always seems to be moving, always slightly urgent. Her brother Mani drove the moon with the wolf Hati behind him, also always closing, never quite catching. 2 wolves, 2 celestial bodies, One long, eternal chase. The day you notice the wolves gaining ground is not a day anyone will see twice. The earth, sitting in the middle of all this, Ymir's flesh, surrounded by the sea of Ymir's blood, was fashioned into a circular world. Its outer edges were given to the Jötnar, and this was not generosity. It was because the outer rim of the world is where the sea crashes against the land, and the cold is permanent, and the darkness is reliable, and this suited the giants well. The inner portion, the habitable middle, was walled off with Ymir's eyebrows. The Norse word Midgard, midpoint enclosure, tells you what the intent was: protection, separation. The human realm was always meant to be a defended thing. Then Odin and his brothers walked along the shore of the new sea, and they found two trees lying on the beach, an ash and an elm, barely alive, barely animate. Ask and Embla, they named them, male and female, and they stood over these two half-dead trees, and they made something. Odin breathed life into them. Vili gave them sense and feeling, and the ability to move purposefully. V gave them blood and good color, and the capacity to speak and hear and see. They gave them clothing, gave them names, gave them the middle world to live in. The first human beings came from trees, from two barely surviving things found on a beach after a flood. There is something fragile about this origin that seems appropriate. The great ash tree Yggdrasil, Ygg's horse, which is to say Odin's gallows, which is to say the tree he would later hang from, was the axis of everything. Its roots reached into three wells. One root coiled into Asgard and down into the well of Urd, where the three Norns sat. Urd, whose name meant something like what has been, Verðandi, what is becoming, Skuld, what must come. They drew water from their well every day and mixed it with the white clay around it and poured this over the wounds in Yggdrasil to keep it from dying. They carved the fates of all living things into the tree's bark. The carvings did not represent fate, they were fate. What was carved happened, there was no revision. The second root reached into Jotunheim and down into the well of Mimir, the well of wisdom, where all knowledge of all things that had happened or would happen was preserved in the water. Mimir drank from it each morning with the horn Gjalla horn, and his knowledge was therefore total and current. The third root reached into Niflheim, back to Gleipnir, the source of the original rivers, the oldest water in the world. A dragon named Nidhugger lived there and gnawed at this root continuously, trying to eat through it, trying to kill the tree from below. It never succeeded. It never stopped trying. An eagle nested in the upper branches of Yggdrasil, and beneath the eagle, between its eyes, a hawk called Veðurfölnir perched. 4 stags wandered the middle reaches of the tree: Dain, Dvalin, Duneir, Durathror, eating its foliage and new growth constantly. Bees fed on the dew that dripped from its leaves, and a squirrel named Ratatoskr ran up and down the trunk from eagle to dragon, carrying messages that were never reconciliatory, maintaining an ancient animosity with remarkable dedication to the task. The tree was always being damaged, always. The deer ate it, The dragon gnawed it. The serpents chewed its roots. The Norns tended it, the water and clay sustaining it, but only just. It shook at Ragnarök. It did not fall, but it shook. This is what Yggdrasil is. The thing being kept alive through continuous effort. The center that holds because someone is always choosing to tend it. Remove the Norns, and the tree dies. Remove the tree, and the worlds fall apart. Everything depends on the willingness of 3 women to keep drawing water from a well. Now to Asgard, and to the ordering of divine power, which was not established all at once, but accumulated through conflict and negotiation and loss. The gods who lived in Asgard were the Aesir, and they were not the only divine beings. The Vanir were older in some ways, connected to different aspects of the world: fertility, the sea, the cycle of seasons, the kind of magic that required sacrifice and transformation rather than strength. Where the Aesir were largely gods of sky and war and wisdom, the Vanir were gods of earth and water and growth. They should have complemented each other perfectly. They went to war instead. The war began because of Gullveig. She was Vanir, or associated with the Vanir, connected to gold and its magic and its power. She came to Asgard and she said things, or represented things, or simply existed in a way that the Aesir found threatening. The exact provocation has been lost, or was never specified, which is one of the genuine frustrations of this material. And the Aesir killed her. They took her body and burned it in the great hall of Odin. And she rose from the fire. They burned her again. She rose. They burned her a 3rd time. And this time, what emerged from the flames was a woman named Hyther, a seeress, a vulva, who traveled the worlds offering prophecy for a price. She had been made by fire. She had been made by the failed attempt to destroy her. The Aesir had not silenced Gullveig. They had transformed her into something that could not be silenced. The war came, gods on both sides, armies in the old sense, and the walls of Asgard broken. The texts do not give us great tactical detail. This was not that kind of war story. What we know is that neither side was capable of truly defeating the other, and that after a time they made peace in the particular way that ancient peace was made, by exchange of hostages, which is to say, by each side sending their most valuable members to live with the other as honored guests who were also leverage. The Vanir sent Njord, the sea god, and his 2 children, the twins Freya and Freyja, to Asgard. Freyja would become one of the most beloved gods of the Norse world, and Freyja would become perhaps the most powerful practitioner of magic in all the 9 worlds. The Aesir sent Mimir, who held all wisdom in his keeping, and Honir, a god described as tall and handsome and good-looking in the way that suggests form over substance. The Vanir quickly discovered that Honir was, while decorative, limited, without Mimir beside him, whispering counsel. Honir could only ever say the same thing, that others should decide. This was not what they had been promised, and they were insulted in the particular way of people who feel they have been cheated in a trade. They cut off Mimir's head. They sent it back to Odin, presumably as a message about their feelings. Odin, when he received the severed head of the wisest being in the 9 worlds, did not despair. He preserved it with herbs, with spoken runes, and he spoke to it, and it spoke to him. Mimir's head continued to advise. The head of Mimir, sitting in Odin's keeping, still contained all wisdom, still had access to all knowledge, and Odin consulted it for the rest of time. I have always found this detail extraordinary. Not that Mimir's head was decapitated and preserved, which is strange enough, but that Odin's first instinct upon receiving it was to make it useful. That is the All-Father's nature, compressed to an essence. The peace between Aesir and Vanir held, more or less. They sealed it additionally in a traditional way. Each side gathered and spat into a great jar, and from the mingled saliva they created a being, Kvasir, who was so wise that there was no question he could not answer. Kvasir walked the worlds answering questions until 2 dwarves killed him and mixed his blood with honey and fermented it into a mead that gave the gift of poetry and wisdom to anyone who drank it. The mead had many adventures afterward. Odin eventually stole it and brought it to Asgard, which is why the Norse said the gift of poetry comes from the gods. The Norse conception of the divine is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely unusual. Asgard was not a perfect realm. It was not heaven in the sense of being removed from suffering and failure. The gods were powerful, certainly, more powerful than humans, capable of things no human could do, but they were not omnipotent, and they were not immortal in any absolute sense. They aged. They needed to eat a particular golden apple to stay young, the apples kept by a goddess named Idun. And when Idun was once kidnapped by a giant, and the gods were deprived of her apples, they began to gray and wrinkle and weaken with frightening speed. The apple eating was not metaphor. The gods required a medicine against time, the same as everything else did. They could be killed. They would be killed. The whole mythology is moving toward the moment when they are all killed, and they know this, and they go about their days anyway. This is what makes Odin's behavior comprehensible, if not quite comfortable. He is a god in full knowledge of his own death, pursuing wisdom and power, not because these will save him, but because they are the most dignified way to fail. He gave one eye to Mimir's well, simply arrived at the edge of the water, reached up and removed it, and dropped it in, and drank. And what he saw in the water sent him somewhere beyond speech for a period that the sources do not specify. The knowledge was total. It did not help him feel better about any of it. He pursued it anyway. He learned to hang. He bound himself to Yggdrasil, hung for 9 nights and 9 days without food or water, wounded by his own spear, a sacrifice offered to himself by himself, Odin to Odin. And on the 9th night, looking down into the roots below, he saw the runes that were not merely letters, but the underlying forces that gave reality its structure. He grabbed them and fell, screaming, and they were his. With runes, he could work any magic, heal wounds, still storms, speak to the dead, loosen bonds, protect in battle. He paid a tremendous price for each piece of knowledge, and he sought the next piece anyway. Immediately. He could not stop. He would not stop. There was always more to know, and there was always less time than he needed. He kept 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, and sent them out each day across all the 9 worlds, and they returned in the evening to perch on his shoulders and speak what they had seen into his ears. He worried more about Munin's return. Thought, if lost, might be managed. Memory, lost, that was irreversible in a way that thought was not. A mind that cannot remember does not know what it has lost. He rode Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse who could travel between worlds, and this horse needs a brief explanation. Sleipnir's mother was a horse. His father was also a horse, technically, but the horse that became his father was Loki in horse form, which is one of those details that the Norse sources deliver with such equanimity that one must pause to appreciate the commitment. A great wall builder came to Asgard once with an offer. He would build Asgard's walls impenetrable within a single winter, and in payment he asked for the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freya. The gods, unwisely, looking back, but they assumed it was impossible, agreed, on condition he used no human help, only his horse, Svadilfari. The horse did most of the work. The walls went up faster than they should have. With 3 days left in winter, the walls were nearly done. The gods panicked and looked at Loki. They reminded him that it was his idea to agree to these terms. They threatened him with various unpleasant things if he failed to fix it. Loki turned into a mare and ran past the building site, and Svadilfari was suddenly far more interested in chasing the mare than in hauling stones. The builder, deprived of his horse, could not finish in time. He revealed himself then to be a Jotun in disguise. The gods had agreed to the terms, not knowing they were made with a frost giant, and Thor killed him with the hammer. Loki, meanwhile, was gone for some time, and when he returned, he was carrying a foal, an 8-legged grey foal, extraordinary in the way the offspring of a supernatural pairing tends to be extraordinary. He gave it to Odin, that is Sleipnir, 2 ravens on his shoulders, 1 eye, a spear that never missed, an 8-legged horse, an enormous hall called Valhalla, where 540 doors opened wide enough for 800 warriors abreast, where the roof was shields and the rafters were spears, where dead warriors trained every day for a battle they could not win. This was the life of the All-Father. This was what passed for comfort. Thor, his son, Odin's son, born of a giantess named Jörð, Earth herself, is a different kind of presence, where Odin is all vertical depth, all descent into wells and sacrifice and uncomfortable knowing. Thor is horizontal energy. He is the force that moves across the world rather than down through it. He drove his goat-drawn chariot across the sky, and the thunder was its wheels. He carried Mjolnir. He could eat an entire ox and drink by the barrel and sleep for a week and then wake up and fight a giant before breakfast. He was not simple. This is something the mythology occasionally obscures. He is capable of cunning when he needs it. When Mjolnir was stolen by the giant Thrymr, and Thrymr demanded Freyja in exchange, Thor went to retrieve his hammer, disguised as a bride, Freyja's veil over his red beard, Loki as his bridesmaid. When they placed Mjolnir in his lap to consecrate the marriage, he grabbed it and killed every giant in the hall. He was capable of humility too, which is rarer. When he traveled to Utgard, disguised as a simple traveler, and was comprehensively humiliated by illusions that made his greatest feats look like nothing, and then the illusions were lifted and revealed that he had nearly drained the sea and had lifted one paw of the Midgard serpent coiled beneath the ocean and had wrestled with time itself without being thrown. He took this information in, and it did not destroy his sense of self. He simply understood something new about scale. What Thor offered that Odin did not, and what the common Norse people seem to have responded to most readily, was accessibility. You knew what you were getting with Thor. You prayed to him for protection, and he went out and swung his hammer at the thing threatening you. There was something clarifying about this. The world is full of complexity and darkness and things that cannot be resolved by effort. Thor represented the things that could be. But Thor's relationship with Loki is the hinge on which a great deal turns, and Loki is the figure who most demands careful handling. He was not a god of evil. I want to be very direct about this, because contemporary culture has made Loki into something the Norse material doesn't quite support. He was a Jotun by birth, the son of a giant named Farbauti and a being named Laufey, and he had blood brotherhood with Odin. They had sworn this in some early time. The sources don't fully illuminate. And he lived among the Aesir and participated in their lives and their stories. He was described as beautiful and cunning and able to change his shape at will. He helped the gods constantly, solving problems, retrieving lost items, extracting them from impossible situations that he had often created in the first place. He was amusing and useful and not to be trusted, and all of these things were simultaneously true at all times. His children were the problem. By a giantess named Angrabotha, the grief-bringer, he fathered 3. The wolf Fenrir, grey and vast and growing. The Midgard serpent Jörmungand, sinuous and patient. And Hel, split vertically into the colors of life and death, her right side living flesh, her left side the blue-black of the long dead. When the Norns spoke concerning these 3 children, the gods acted with the preemptive violence of the genuinely afraid. They seized all 3 from Angrabotha. Jörmungandr was thrown into the great sea that encircled Midgard. He grew until he encircled the world and bit his own tail, and the sea around him moved differently because of him. Hel was taken to Niflheim and given rulership of its dead, of all who died of illness and age and accident, all who did not die in battle, the vast majority of everyone. And Fenrir was brought to Asgard itself, because the gods thought they could keep an eye on him there, which was the kind of reasoning that looks less reasonable the further you get from it. The wolf grew. He grew with the specific wrongness of things that grow too fast, too hungrily, too without limit. The gods tried twice to chain him with iron, massive chains, the kind that should hold continents. And Fenrir flexed and they shattered both times. Then the gods went to the dwarves. The dwarves made Gleipnir. It looked like silk ribbon, thin and soft, and it was made from 6 things that do not exist: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird. 6 absences woven together into a binding. Things that have no substance cannot be broken by any physical force, because there is nothing in them for physical force to engage. Fenrir looked at this ribbon and knew something was wrong with it immediately. He agreed to let them put it on him, only on one condition. One of the gods must place their hand in his mouth as guarantee of good faith. The gods looked at each other. Tyr stepped forward. Tyr, whose name some scholars connect to the root that gives us the word deity, the god of justice and law and the ordered keeping of oaths. He was the god of the deal being kept, and he put his hand into the wolf's open mouth as warranty. They put Gleipnir around the wolf. The wolf strained. The ribbon held. The wolf strained harder. The ribbon held. Tyr's hand did not come back. They drove a sword through Fenrir's jaw to keep it open, and they chained him with a chain called Gelja to a boulder called Gjöll, not the same Gjöll as the river at the boundary of Hell, a different stone, and they drove the boulder into a great slab of rock called Thviti, and this they drove deep into the ground of an island. The wolf waits there. His upper jaw presses against the sky. His lower jaw presses against the earth. He is howling. When Ragnarök comes, the chain will break. I need to pause here. Let me collect the thread. The Norse cosmos at this point is an architecture of suspension. Everything dangerous has been contained. Nothing has been resolved. Fenrir bound and waiting. Jormungandr circling the world below the sea. Hel ruling the colorless dead. Loki bound in a cave. His wife Sigyn catching the dripping venom in a bowl above his face. Odin wandering with his ravens and his one eye and his endless, costly knowledge-seeking. Thor driving the giants back from the borders of Midgard with a hammer that always returns to his hand. The Einherjar training in Valhalla for a battle everyone knows is coming. The Norns carving. The wolf will eventually break his chains. The serpent will eventually let go of its tail. Loki will eventually escape. These are not maybes. These are scheduled events. The gods contain the disaster without preventing it, and they know the difference, and they continue anyway. Let me tell you about Balder, because the story of Balder is the moment when the myth's emotional reality becomes unavoidable. He was Odin's son, and he was loved, universally, unreservedly, in a way that the sources struggle to convey precisely because such love is hard to describe without sounding sentimental, and these are not sentimental myths. He was bright, he was kind, he was not cunning, and he was not complicated, and this was not a weakness. In a cosmos full of gods who were always calculating their next advantage, his uncalculating warmth was something different, something the other gods seemed to gather around without entirely knowing why. He dreamed of his own death. When Balder told his parents about the dreams, something shifted in the house of the gods. Frigg, his mother, went out into the world, and she asked everything she could reach to swear that it would never harm Balder. Every plant, every stone, every animal, every disease, every poison, every metal. They swore, all of them. The ash tree and the iron and the cold and the venom and the wolves, they swore. And the gods, being gods, made a game of it. They stood Balder in the open and threw things at him and watched everything swerve away harmlessly. Spears changing direction, rocks bouncing off, fire refusing to catch. It was a spectacle, and it was also, I think, the gods doing something they rarely permitted themselves, enjoying something beautiful and fragile that they loved, throwing things at it just to see it be unharmed, delighting in the safety of something they were afraid of losing. Loki watched. He went to Frigg disguised as an old woman, and he was friendly and curious, and he asked, conversationally, had she really gotten everything to swear? Everything. And Frigg, with the specific weariness of someone who has done a great work and does not want to be questioned about its boundaries, said almost everything. There was a small plant, mistletoe, growing to the west of Valhalla. It had seemed too young, too inconsequential to bother with. She had not asked it. Loki went and found the mistletoe and cut it and shaped it into a dart and brought it to Höður, Balder's own brother, who was blind and had been standing outside the game because he could not aim. Loki guided his hand. He told him to join his brothers in honoring Balder. He aimed the mistletoe for him. He threw. The dart landed. Balder fell. He was dead before he touched the ground. The sources say this so quickly, so simply, that the enormity of it requires a moment to arrive. The first real death among the Aesir, the loss of the most beloved of them all. The gods could not speak for a long time. Then they wept, and the weeping of the gods is not described often in these texts, which tells you something about what this moment was. This was grief they did not know how to carry, because they had not had to carry it before. Frigg asked who would ride to Hel and offer ransom for Balder. A god named Hermod volunteered, one of Odin's sons, brave in the particular way of people who act before they have time to think. Odin lent him Sleipnir, and he rode. He rode 9 days and 9 nights through valleys so deep and dark that the darkness had texture and weight, until he came to the river Gjöll and the bridge across it, the Gjallabru, roofed with gold. The guardian of the bridge was a woman named Moldgur, and she stopped him and asked his name and lineage. She said he had a different sound than the dead who had recently crossed. 5 armies of dead men had ridden across the bridge that day, she said, and their passing had not made the sound his single set of hooves made. Life echoes differently than death, even in transit. He told her he was riding to find Balder. She told him Balder had gone down, deeper, to Hel herself. He rode on. He rode to Hel's gate, a great gate, and Sleipnir gathered himself and jumped it, which is the kind of thing an 8-legged horse born of supernatural parentage can do. He found his way to Hel's hall, and there, in the seat of honor, was Balder, pale, as all the dead are pale in that place. But there, he was there, being treated with the honor appropriate to his status, which is to say that even in death, Baldur's belovedness had preceded him. Hermodr stayed the night. In the morning, he made his case to Hel. He described the grief of every living thing. He said the gods would give anything. Hel listened and set her terms with the flatness of someone who has made many such deals and has no sentimentality about any of them. If every living thing weeps for Baldur, she will release him. If a single thing refuses to weep, he stays. The gods went everywhere and asked everything to weep for Baldur. The grief was universal and genuine. Trees wept, stones wept, metal wept. Every creature in every world shed tears for the bright god. And then, in a cave, they found a giantess named Thok sitting dry-eyed, and she said what she said. She had gotten no good from Baldur. Let Hel keep what Hel holds. Let the old man grieve. Thok was Loki. The sources say this without elaboration, without explaining Loki's motive beyond what his nature might suggest, without telling us what Loki felt, if anything, when he made this choice. He had killed Baldur by proxy. He had then personally ensured that Baldur could not return, and we are given no access to the inside of this, no guilt, no exultation, no reasoning, just the fact of it, sitting there. The gods could not touch Loki while they were in Hel's realm, for this was sacred ground, or truce ground, or simply not the place. They went home. They built Baldur's funeral. His ship was called Hringhorni, the greatest ship in the world, and they tried to launch it for the pyre, and it would not move. They sent for a Volva from the land of the giants, a woman named Hyrrokin, who arrived riding a wolf with serpents for reins. She got off the wolf, walked to the ship, and shoved it down the rollers into the sea so hard that fire ran from the rollers and the earth shook and the gods fell over. Then they carried Baldur's body on board. His wife Nanna looked at the body and her heart broke. This is not metaphor. The sources say her heart burst with grief and she died, and they laid her on the pyre beside her husband. Odin laid on Baldur's body the ring Gleipnir, the gold ring that dripped 8 copies of itself every 9 nights. He whispered something in Baldur's ear. No one has ever known what he said. Thor consecrated the pyre with Mjolnir. A dwarf ran under Thor's feet and Thor killed it, almost automatically, almost reflexively, as if his grief expressed itself in available violence. The ship burned out to sea. That is how the Norse gods mourned their dead. The ship and the fire and the sea. The ring laid on the chest. The private word no one else will ever hear. There is nothing tidy about it. The gods found Loki eventually, as they always found him eventually. He had hidden in a waterfall in the form of a salmon, but he had made a tactical error. While waiting in his hiding place, he had idly worked out the design of a fish trap. He had cast this into the fire when he heard the gods approaching, but they saw its shape in the coals and understood what it was, and wove one and caught him. They bound him with the entrails of his son Nafi, transformed to iron when used for this purpose. A serpent was placed above him to drip venom on his face. His wife Sigyn stood beside him with a bowl to catch the drops, and she caught them faithfully, but when she turned to empty the bowl, the drops fell, and his convulsions as the venom hit him, shook the earth. The Norse told each other this when the ground moved, Loki writhing in his cave, the venom landing. He lies there. He waits with Fenrir on opposite ends of the world, and both of them patient with the patience of things that have no choice but to wait. Anyway, there is a world of heroes running alongside the world of gods, and the two are not separate. They interweave, they bleed into each other. The bloodlines of the Aesir mixing with human blood in ways that produced half-divine warriors and fated tragedies, and women who saw the future, and men who could not be killed by ordinary weapons. I want to spend some time in this world because it contains some of the most fully human storytelling in the Norse tradition, which is saying something. The greatest of the heroic lineages was the Volsung line, and it traced its origins through a number of generations, through kings and their adventures and their occasional divine encounters, ultimately back to Odin, not metaphorically. Literally, the Volsungs carried something of the All-Father's blood in them, and they were his particular project, his investment, his experiment in what divine purpose looked like when filtered through mortal flesh and mortal limitation. The story of Sigurður begins before he is born, begins in fact with his father's father and the sword that was pulled from a tree. Völsung, the ancestor whose name the whole dynasty carries, had a son named Sigmundur, and Sigmundur's story began at a feast. Odin appeared at the feast, as he tends to appear at important moments. Old man, wide-brimmed hat, one eye, and drove a sword into the great tree at the center of the hall, up to its hilt, deep into the living wood. He said whoever could pull it free could have it. This is the specific shape of Odin's gifts. He arrives with something extraordinary and leaves it in a position where it can only be obtained through proof of worth, and then he disappears and watches to see who is worthy. Every man at the feast tried. 10 men, 20, 40. The sword stayed in the tree. Then Sigmundur walked up and pulled it out with one hand, as if it had been waiting for specifically him. It probably had. The sword's name was Grama, which you might translate as fierce or angry, and it was the finest blade that had been made or would be made in the mortal world. Sigmundur used it for many years and many deeds, and eventually Odin came back and broke it. This is the thing about Odin's gifts. They are real. They are extraordinary. They are also temporary, and Odin decides when they end. He stood in the path of Sigmundur's last battle and blocked Gramr with his spear, thrust it in the way of the blade, and the great sword shattered. Sigmundur fell, mortally wounded. He lay dying, and he told his pregnant wife to gather the fragments. These pieces were for his son. His son would reforge them. He had not yet been born, but already his purpose had been defined. Sigurd was born into a world that already expected things of him. He was fostered with a figure named Regin, who was perhaps a dwarf, perhaps half-dwarf, perhaps something the sources don't entirely settle, a being of great craft and deep resentment who had his own reasons for shaping a hero. Regin taught Sigurður everything, the runes in their full scope, weaponcraft, languages, 6 of them, or more, the harp, the history of kingdoms, and the politics of power. He taught with genuine care and genuine agenda, and Sigurd learned from both simultaneously. When Sigurd was old enough, Regin put his request to him, "Kill my brother. My brother Fafnir took our father's gold and killed him for it, and then the weight of the gold and the murder transformed him. He is no longer a man, he is a dragon now. He lies on the hoard on Ginnungagap, and he poisons the land with his breath, and he grows larger each year. I want the gold. I want him dead. Will you do it?" Sigurd went first to his foster father's forge and brought the shards of Grammar, his father's sword, and asked Regin to reforge it. Regin forged a sword. Sigurd tested it on the anvil, and it broke. Regin forged another. It broke. Then Sigurd reforged the fragments himself, in a fire built to his specifications, worked by his own hands, and the blade that emerged from this was different in kind from what any other smith had made. He tested it on the great Rhine, dropping a tuft of wool onto the current upstream and holding the blade in the flow. The wool hit the blade and parted without resistance. He took the sword to the anvil and struck down with his full strength, and the anvil split from crown to base, cleanly, and the sword was not chipped or blunted. Grammar was whole again, his father's broken sword remade into something that could cut through anything in the world. He rode to Ginnungagap. Regin told him to dig a trench in the path between the dragon's lair and the river it went to drink from, and wait in the trench and drive the sword up into the dragon's belly as it passed overhead. This is what Sigurd did. He dug the trench and lay in it, and the earth shook when Fafnir came, and the shadow of the dragon blotted out the light and the blood of it. When the sword went in, flooded the trench. He came up out of the trench, covered in dragon's blood, and the dragon lay dying beside him. Fafnir spoke as he died. He asked who Sigurd was. He warned him about the cursed gold, about the ring Andvaranaut specifically, which had been cursed by the dwarf Andvari, whose gold it originally was, cursed to destroy whoever possessed it, and the curse had worked its way through several owners already before coming to rest under Fafnir. "Take the gold," Fafnir said, "but know what it carries." Sigurd said he would take it anyway. He had not come this far to leave empty-handed. Some portion of him, perhaps, understood that cursed gold is still gold, and that the curse, like fate, was not a reason to refuse a thing, but simply a condition to be aware of. He roasted Fafnir's heart on a spit to give to Regin as his portion of the kill. He burned his thumb, testing whether it was cooked, and put the burned thumb in his mouth, and tasted the dragon's blood, and the world shifted. He could understand birds. The birds, nuthatches, sitting in the branches above, were discussing Regin. At some length, they were saying, with the matter-of-fact clarity of creatures who have no reason to be indirect, that Regin was planning to kill Sigurd once the heart was ready, that he had always been planning this, that a swordsmith who has raised a weapon to a fine edge might reasonably be afraid of what the weapon does unsupervised. Sigurd listened to all of it. Then he cut off Regin's head. He ate Fafnir's heart himself. He loaded the gold onto his horse. Grani descended from Sleipnir, a horse who could carry the weight of a dragon's hoard without slowing. He rode. The birds had told him more than about Regin. They had told him about Hindarfjall, a mountain surrounded by fire, and a figure lying asleep within the flames. He rode. He found the mountain and the fire and went through it. Grani did not hesitate, which is one of the things about Odin's lineage of horses. They do not hesitate at fire. And on the mountain he found a body in full armor. He cut through the armor and found beneath it a woman. She was a Valkyrie. She had been asleep for many years, placed under a sleep spell by Odin himself as punishment for choosing the wrong side in a battle. She had granted victory to a king Odin had not designated because she thought the other king deserved it more, which is the kind of independent judgment that Odin respected in principle and could not permit in practice. Her name was Brynhildr, the armored battle, and she had been sleeping in full armor in a ring of fire, waiting for a man without fear to come and wake her. Sigurd woke her. She taught him more runes, victory runes, wave runes, runes for healing, and runes for speech, and runes for understanding. She gave him the full curriculum of what a person needs to know to navigate fate with as much grace as fate permits. They pledged to each other. He gave her Andvaranot, the cursed ring, the one that had already been through Andvari and Hreidmar and Fafnir and Regin and was now in Sigurdr's keeping. He gave it to her as a love pledge and rode away. Why he left her is one of the questions the material raises and does not answer. Perhaps he had more of his destiny to fulfill before he could return. Perhaps the world road between them was longer than either of them knew. What happened was, he came to the hall of King Juki, and Juki's wife Grimhildr gave him mead to drink, and the mead contained something, an herb of forgetfulness, and he forgot Brynhildr. Not vaguely, not in the fading way of time, completely, as if she had never been. He married Gijuki's daughter, Gudrun, and was happy in the way of a person who does not know what they have lost. He helped his new brother-in-law, Gunnar, win a bride, and the bride Gunnar wanted was Brynhildr, who still waited in her fire. Gunnar's horse would not go through the flames. Gunnar tried another horse. It would not go either. Sigurd transformed himself with Grimhildr's magic into Gunnar's shape, and Grani went through the fire without hesitation, and Sigurd, in Gunnar's form, spent 3 nights with Brynhildr, with his sword laid between them as a barrier. The sources are specific about this. The sword between them, the barrier, and he won her. Brynhildr looked at the man who had come through her fire, and she did not know, could not know, that it was Sigurd. The one person who could have ridden through her fire was riding through it on behalf of someone else, and everything that followed came from this. The quarrel that revealed it was the kind of quarrel that myths use to demonstrate how small actions carry enormous consequences. 2 queens on a riverbank, wading in, arguing about whose husband was higher in rank, whose was better, whose was the greater man. Gudrun said her husband Sigurd had killed the dragon and ridden through the fire. Brynhilda said Gunnar had also ridden through the fire to win her, and Gudrun held up the ring Andvaranaut, which Sigurdr had given Brynhilda as a pledge of love, and then, when his memory returned in fragments later, we are not told exactly when or how, must have found its way back into the family. Brynhilda recognized the ring. She understood. She went to the men of Gijuki's hall and said Sigurdr had boasted of having her before her husband did. This was a lie, a deliberate weapon, designed to produce a specific outcome, Sigurdr's death. Honor worked in very particular ways in the Norse world. An accusation of this kind required a response. Gunnar and his brother Guttormr, who was young enough not to have sworn brotherhood with Sigurdr and was therefore technically capable of killing him without oath breach, took the shape of a murder plot and made it into an event. They killed Sigurdr in his bed. Some sources say in the forest. The location varies. His death does not. Gudrun woke to it, and her grief. The sources describe her grief with unusual care, as if the writers felt it owed more space than the death itself. Her grief was total, and it was not quiet. She did not perform mourning. She broke. And Brynhilda, who had arranged all of this, stood beside her and wept. The sources say she wept and laughed simultaneously, which is the kind of detail that stops you in your tracks if you let it. She had gotten what she asked for. She had destroyed the person she had never stopped loving. She told Gunnar that he had done it all wrong, that he had let himself be used, that the gold would kill him as it had killed everyone. She walked onto Sigurd's funeral pyre. She spoke last words that some versions preserve in extraordinary detail, a final account of what she knew and what she had done and why. And then the fire took them both. The cursed gold moved on. This is what the Norse conception of fate looks like from the inside. Everyone knowing, everyone acting anyway, the knowledge and the action running parallel in the same being without either cancelling the other out. Brynhilda knew what the gold was. Sigurd knew what the gold was. Fafnir told him with his dying breath, and it didn't matter. The gold was still gold, and desire does not pause for warnings. There is a figure in the Norse tradition who exists at the border between this world of heroes and the world of the divine dead, and that is the Völva, the seeress, the prophetess, the woman who could see what the Norns had carved. The Völva occupies a singular position. She knows, and she tells, and the telling does not change the knowing. The entire poem of the Völuspá is framed as Odin asking a dead Völva to tell him the history and future of the world, and she does. She tells him everything. She tells him exactly how he will die. She tells him what comes after. She says, "See you later," and goes back to where the dead go. This is the shape of prophecy in Norse mythology, not ambiguous, not cryptic in the Greek style of oracles that could be misread. Clear, direct. You will lose. Here is how. Here is what comes after the losing. I want to say something about Freya at more length, because she has been mentioned in passing, and she deserves more than a passage. She was the daughter of Njörð, the twin of Freya, and she came to Asgard as part of the peace settlement with the Vanir, and she became the most powerful magic user in the 9 worlds, including among the gods themselves. Seidr, the form of shamanistic magic that involved sitting on a raised platform and entering a trance and traveling between worlds in spirit form and seeing and affecting what could be seen and affected. Freya had this. She taught it to Odin, which is how Odin acquired one of his most significant powers. She taught it to him, and then he practiced it and made it his own. And the mythology tends to attribute Seidr to Odin, while also acknowledging that he learned it from her, which is a dynamic that should be more discussed than it is. She had a hall of her own in Asgard, called Folkvanger, the field of the host, and she chose half the battle slain for herself. Odin took the other half to Valhalla. Freya got half the dead warriors, and she got them first. The choice went to her, and then the remainder went to Odin. This is rarely mentioned in popular retellings of Norse mythology, probably because it complicates the Valhalla narrative, but it is there in the sources. She wept tears of gold for her husband Oath, who wandered and was absent, and whose nature the mythology never fully explains. She searched for him as a bird, crying. The gold tears fell into the earth and into the sea. Some say that is where gold comes from in the first place. Her weeping was the origin of the metal that would later carry the curse that would destroy the Völsung line. If this genealogy of gold is deliberate, it is one of the most quietly devastating connections in the entire mythological tradition. The metal of grief became the metal of corruption. She owned Brisingamen, the necklace that was the most beautiful object in all the 9 worlds, made by 4 dwarves who asked as payment that she spend 1 night with each of them. She agreed. She went and spent 4 nights in the dwarves' halls and came out wearing the necklace, and this is stated without editorial in the sources. She wanted it, and the price was what it was, and she paid it. Loki, predictably, found out and told Odin, and Odin made her perform 2 unpleasant tasks as punishment, which is a detail that contains a whole politics of divine hierarchy if you look at it directly. She was, above all these things, herself. There is something about Freya that the other gods lack, something that reads as presence in the full sense. She occupies her life completely. She weeps openly and travels in grief and desires things and acquires them and mourns and loves and practices her craft without performing any of it for an audience. She is not performing Freya. She simply is Freya. In a mythology full of gods who are always strategizing their next move, this is actually unusual. The world moved toward its ending. Not all at once, not in a rush, but in the way of a tide coming in. Each wave looking like it might recede. Each year, the water a little higher on the shore. The gods knew this. The signs were accumulating. Brothers were killing brothers, as the prophecy said they would. The winters were growing harder. The moral atmosphere of the world was changing in ways that were difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. And then came the Fimbulwinter. 3 winters, one following the other, without summer between them. Snow from all directions, north, east, south, west. It blew from everywhere, and there was no angle of shelter. Ice everywhere. The sky the color of old metal. The animals struggling in the fields. The crops that could not grow. And with the cold came something the cold enabled. The dissolution of obligation. the bonds between people, which are partly practical and partly moral, and partly just the understanding that the alternative is worse, these began to loosen. Brother killed brother, as the prophecy had said. Cousin fought cousin. The family units, which were the basic structure of Norse social organization, the thing around which law and protection and obligation organized themselves, these collapsed under the pressure. The Norse understood that civilization is a fragile arrangement. The Fimbulwinter was not just a climate event, it was a test of every social agreement simultaneously, and the agreements failed, and the test revealed what the underlying reality had always been. When food runs short enough, the bonds of courtesy become negotiable. When they become negotiable, they become optional. When they become optional, they disappear. After the Fimbulwinter, the wolf Skirl will catch the sun. He has been chasing it across the sky for the entirety of the world's existence, always one step behind, always running. At Ragnarök, he catches it. He swallows it. The sky goes dark. The wolf Hati catches the moon and swallows it. The stars fall from the skull of Ymir, fall back to earth, back to Ymir's own remains, the circle closing. The earth shakes, the mountains fall, every tree is uprooted. Fenrir breaks his chains. The chain Gleipnir, made of impossible things, made of absences, it breaks. The wolf opens his jaw, and the sources say his upper jaw scrapes the sky, and his lower jaw scrapes the earth, and he would open further if there were room. The Midgard serpent Jörmungand releases its own tail and rises from the sea, and the sea rises too, and the land floods, and the ship Naglfar is lifted and floats, the ship made from dead men's fingernails and toenails, the ship whose construction was fed whenever someone was buried without their nails being trimmed, the ship that has been building itself silently from this material for the entire history of the world. Loki captains it. Loki, freed from the cave, his skin scarred from the venom, his face changed by centuries of pain, he sails the ship of dead men's nails toward the final battle. His children Fenrir and Jörmungandr move across the flooding world. The fire giant Surtur marches from Muspelheim at last. After all this time, after standing at the boundary since before the world was made, his sword blazing, the rainbow bridge Bifrost cracks under his army's boots. It was built for gods, not for the Fire Lord's hordes, and it breaks. Heimdall blows Gjallarhorn. The sound is so large that the mythology struggles to contain it. It is heard in every world simultaneously. The gods wake, if they have slept. The Einherjar, all 540 times 800 of them, stream out of Valhalla through the enormous doors. The gods arm themselves. Odin goes one last time to Mimir's well, the severed head that has advised him for all the long ages of the world. And we are not told what Mimir says to him there, at the end, when there is nothing left to advise except perhaps, you knew, you always knew. You did everything you could and it wasn't enough, and you did it anyway. The battlefield is Vigridr, the plain so vast it takes 100 leagues to cross. The combats are specific, and they are recorded with a specificity that honors them as specific deaths rather than statistical casualties. Odin, with his spear Gungnir that never misses, goes against Fenrir. The wolf swallows him. The All-Father, who knew from the beginning that this was how he ended, disappears into the wolf's throat. His son Vidar, the silent god, the god of silence and vengeance, who has been prepared for this single moment, who wears a boot made from the accumulated discarded leather of all the cobblers who ever trimmed a shoe, kills the wolf. He drives his boot into the wolf's lower jaw and tears the upper jaw upward, or he drives his sword into the wolf's heart through the open mouth, or both. He avenges his father. This is the only revenge in Norse mythology that is clean and complete and accomplished by exactly the person who had reason to do it. Thor goes against Jörmungandr. He kills the serpent, which is already extraordinary, the serpent who encircled the world, who was the boundary between the human realm and the outer dark, who was so large that his body curved with the curve of the earth. Thor kills it and takes 9 steps back. The venom reaches him before the 10th step. He falls. Freya fights Surtur with an antler. His self-fighting sword had been given away long ago, given to Skirnir in exchange for a successful courtship, and this was a sword that would have mattered at Ragnarök, that might have made a difference, and he knew that when he gave it away, or came to know it later, he fights with an antler and kills one giant, and then Surtur's fire takes him. He dies. He knew he would. He had decided that love was worth the sword, or that the end was coming anyway, or both. Tyr and the hound Garm, who guards the entrance to Hel's realm, fight each other and kill each other. Loki and Heimdall, who have been in opposition since the earliest stories, who represent fundamentally incompatible orientations to the world. The Trickster and the Watchman, the one who becomes anything and the one who can see anything. They find each other in the battle, and they kill each other simultaneously. This feels like the most inevitable death in the mythology, the two most defined by perception, the one who sees through everything, and the one who can be anything, neutralizing each other at last. Surtur, having survived the battle, takes his sword and sweeps it. He was there at the beginning, standing at the border of fire, and he is here at the end, and he sweeps his sword across the worlds. The fire is everywhere. The earth sinks, the sea rises, the sky folds, the tree shakes, and then there is silence, and there is water, and there is nothing for a long time that the poetry specifies, and then the earth rises from the sea. New, green, the sources describe fields unsown that grow grain anyway, as if the fertility of the world was always there, waiting under the destruction, needing only the destruction to clear the way. Rivers run with fish, eagles rise above new cliffs. Balder comes back from Hel. He comes back because Hel's terms, that all things must weep for him, have finally been met, not by asking, but by the death of the world being sufficient grief. Hother comes back with him. Young gods, children of the fallen, gather on the field where Asgard used to stand. They look at each other. They look at the new green world, and there, in the new grass growing over the ruins of the old world, they find the golden gaming pieces, the ones the old gods used to play with in the time before, half buried, glinting in the new light. The children of the dead gods pick them up and hold them and remember. Leif and Leifthrasil emerge from Yggdrasil's shelter, two humans who hid inside the tree while everything outside burned, who survived on morning dew, who are now the new ancestors. The tree held, it shook in the fire, and it held, because the Norns had not stopped tending it, because some things cannot be destroyed by even the fire of the end of everything, because the tree was made to be the last thing standing, or the last thing needed. The new world is described briefly. It is described as better than the old one, which is perhaps the most radical thing the Völuspá says. The world that comes after Ragnarök will be better. Balder and Hörður together, which was never possible while both were alive in the old world, since Hörður killed Balder. The fields unplanted that grow, the morning dew that sustains new life. Better. Something arrives in the sky above Gimle, a hall brighter than the sun, where something or someone presides. The sources are deliberately vague here. A mighty one is invoked. Scholars have argued for centuries about whether this is Christianization, whether Snorri's faith bled into his transcription, whether there was an original Norse concept of this presence before the churches came. It may be both. It may be that the Norse mythological tradition, confronting the absolute darkness of Ragnarök, always needed something beyond it, and that what they imagined there was not specific enough to survive the conversion without being quietly replaced. The shape is left. The name is not given. What we are left with, then, is a cosmos that ends and begins again, gods who die and whose children inherit, a tree that survives, a pair of humans who survive, golden pieces found in the new grass. The mythology does not end with silence. It ends with memory, with the children of the fallen picking up the objects their parents played with and holding them and beginning to understand what they are holding. This is something I have sat with for a long time, and I still don't know exactly what to do with it. The Norse tradition is unique in world mythology, or at least unusual enough to deserve the word unusual, in its insistence that the gods are going to lose, not as a trial that ends in redemption, not as a fall that will be reversed, not as a test with a right answer at the end. They are going to fight Ragnarök, and they are going to lose, and the world is going to end. They know this. They have known this since the Norns began carving. Odin has known it since he drank from Mimir's well, and whatever he saw there sent him out into the 9 worlds, gathering everything he could. The whole structure of Valhalla, the whole apparatus of the Einherjar, it is preparation for a defeat that cannot be prevented, only met with as much courage as can be assembled. There is a word sometimes used in discussions of this mythology, a concept of active courage in the face of known defeat, the decision to act fully knowing that the action will not be enough. It is what Tyr does when he puts his hand in the wolf's mouth. It is what Thor does, going out to push the giants back from Midgard's borders every winter, knowing that eventually the borders will not hold. It is what Odin does every day, wandering and gathering and preparing for an end he has already seen in full detail. The act is not diminished by the knowledge of failure. The act is, in some ways, enlarged by it. I find this harder to sit with than almost anything else in mythology, not because it is despairing. It is not despairing. It is the opposite of despairing. It is the decision, made in full information, to act anyway, to build anyway, to love the world, even knowing the world will end. The Norse people who lived these stories lived in a place that was genuinely harsh. Winter that could kill, sea that took ships without return, enemies that were real, and the cold that was realer. They did not have a mild weather mythology. They built something that could contain actual darkness and still produce the instruction, keep going. The stories spread with the people who carried them. The Norse longships went everywhere, up rivers into the east, west across the open Atlantic, to Iceland and Greenland, and the coast of North America, for a brief, startling time, south along trade routes to Constantinople. Wherever they went, they brought what they knew, including what they knew about the world's structure and the gods' nature, and the relationship between fate and action. Some of it survived conversion. Some of it went underground and came back up changed. Some of it stayed in place names. The days of the week are full of it. Tuesday, Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Frigg's Day. The 4th through 7th days of the week are named for Norse and Germanic deities, which means that every English speaker says these names without thinking about them twice a week at least, has been saying them for over 1,000 years. The mythology survived in the Icelandic sagas and the Eddas, preserved by people who were sometimes nostalgic and sometimes scholarly, and sometimes just unwilling to let the old stories go, even as they built churches and accepted the new faith. Snorri Sturluson, who gave us so much, died violently in 1241, killed in a political dispute that had nothing to do with his writing. But the writing remained. The prose Edda remained. The poetic Edda remained. The stories moved from manuscript to printing press to scholarship to popular culture, shifted in each move, some things lost and some things found. The core of them recognizable across all these transformations. What returns again and again is not the hammer or the ravens or the wolves, though these persist. What returns is the underlying structure, the knowledge of ending held in the same hand as the decision to continue. This is the thing that the Norse mythology gave to the human mythological tradition that other traditions don't quite have. Not a way out, not a promise of ultimate victory, just, you know how this ends, and you go anyway, and there is something in the going that matters independently of the outcome. The gaming pieces in the new grass, the children of the fallen finding them, the gold that was grief first, and then corruption, and then something found in the aftermath of fire. I can't tell you what Odin whispered in Baldur's ear before the pyre. Nobody can. The Norse tradition understood that some things are not for transmission, that the most important words are the ones that exist between two people in a specific moment and are not recorded, and that this is as it should be, and that the silence around them is not a deficiency, but a shape. Good night, wherever you are. May the winter be short and the tree hold. May you wake into the new green field and find something golden in the grass. I'll see you in the next one.